Montana, November 1944. The truck stopped. Clara Marsh stepped down onto frozen ground and stood very still. There was no fence. She looked left. Wooden posts at intervals set into the earth with the casual permanence of something installed without particular urgency. Nothing between them. She looked right. The same. Open land running north toward a tree line perhaps 300 meters away, and beyond that mountains rising into a sky that was the specific pale blue of high altitude in late autumn. No wire, no watchtowers, no dogs, no secondary perimeter, no visible deterrent of any kind. Clara had been in enough places to understand what the absence of a fence meant. When they stopped needing one, it was because they had prepared something worse. Ruth Calloway stepped down from the truck and stood beside her. Ruth was 19 years old from a town of 4,000 people near Stuttgart, and she had never learned to conceal what she was thinking because nothing in her previous life had given her a reason to develop that particular skill. She had the quality of someone for whom the interior and the exterior had never been required to disagree. "Where is the wire?" Ruth said quietly in German. Nobody answered. The nearest American soldier, a corporal named Walt Bram, heard the question. He turned and looked at the posts, then back at Ruth, then at the posts again, as though the question were genuinely strange to him, as though the answer were so obvious that being asked it at all was the confusing part. He did not answer. He turned and called the group to follow him toward the processing building. Clara picked up her bag and walked. She had been a cartographer for 3 years before the war, and the habit of measurement did not stop because the landscape changed. In the time it took to walk from the truck to the building, she noted the following, without choosing to the distance from the nearest post to the tree line, was approximately 300 meters over flat ground. The vegetation pattern along the eastern edge suggested a water source somewhere beyond the visible horizon. The nearest settlement, judged by the road they had traveled, and the angle of the afternoon sun was somewhere between 12 and 15 miles to the south. She filed all of this and said nothing. The map did not require her feelings about the terrain. The map required precision. Precision was something Clara Marsh was very good at. What she could not map, standing in the Montana dust with the cold coming through her coat, was the particular quality of the absence she was looking at. Not just the absence of wire. Something underneath it. Something with an outline she could feel but not yet trace. She kept walking. She noted the gap between two posts as she passed through it. She noted the distance to the tree line. She noted the mountain profile to the west and the agricultural land falling away to the south and the approximate position of the road they had arrived on. She was a cartographer. She could not look at a space without measuring it, and she was already without choosing to measuring the ways out. She had spent 11 days crossing the Atlantic in the hold of a transport ship. There had been 190 women on board from different units in different cities and different degrees of certainty about what was coming. They slept in hammocks stacked 3 high and breathed air that thickened by the second day with anxiety and the smell of too many people and not enough space. The American guards on the ship were not what Clara had prepared herself for. She had expected a performance, either the performance of deliberate cruelty, which she had been told to anticipate, or the performance of calculated kindness, which she had been warned was equally dangerous and equally false. What she found instead was something harder to categorize. The guards were professionally indifferent. They had a job. The job was moving 190 German women across an ocean without incident. They were doing the job with the focused competence of people who had done similar work before and expected to do it again. Whether the women were frightened or grateful or furious was not apparently a matter of significant operational interest to any of them. This bothered Clara more than hostility would have. On the 6th day, she was given 20 minutes on deck with a group of 10 women. The Atlantic was gray and enormous and cold in every direction. She stood at the railing and breathed air that tasted of open water. It was the first time in weeks she had stood inside a space she could not see to the edges of. A guard stood nearby. He was perhaps 25 with the look of a man who had been watching the same water for too many consecutive days and had arrived at a kind of peace with it. After a few minutes without looking at her directly, he reached into his pocket and produced a pack of cigarettes. He held it in her direction. Clara looked at the cigarettes. She understood the mechanism immediately and completely. A small investment in compliance. A gesture calculated to produce gratitude and reduce resistance. The formula was clear. She took a cigarette. He lit it, put the lighter back, looked at the water. They stood in silence for 10 minutes. He said nothing. She said nothing. When her time was up, she went back below. She turned that moment over in her mind for 2 full days afterward. She was looking for the calculation inside it, the deliberate withholding of expectation as its own kind of pressure, the studied indifference as theater designed to make her lower her guard. She could not find it. He had offered and then looked away. He had not checked to see if she accepted. He had not monitored her reaction. The gesture had simply been made, and then it was over, with no apparent investment in the outcome. She did not mention this to Ruth. America arrived as a coastline through fog. Green, impossibly, almost aggressively green, compared to what they had left behind. Clara pressed her face to the porthole and held it there for a long time. It was intact. Not intact in the way of a city that had been damaged and rebuilt. Intact in the way of a place that had never been touched at all. The buildings behind the port were whole. The streets were clear. The infrastructure was simply present, functioning, continuous, as though the concept of damage had not occurred to it. Clara filed this and said nothing. Trucks carried them west through countryside that did not behave the way European countryside behaved. Fields and small towns and white churches and farms with red barns and gas stations with actual fuel. The scale of it was difficult to process. This was a country built by people who had never needed to build things close together because there had always been more space, and the space had simply continued in every direction without apology. She mapped it anyway. She could not help it. By the time the truck turned north onto a dirt road and the camp came into view, she had constructed a working model of the surrounding terrain. Flat agricultural land giving way to foothills to the west, mountains beyond already white at their peaks in October. A river somewhere to the east, not visible but inferable from the vegetation pattern. The nearest town approximately 13 to 14 miles south. The truck stopped. She stepped down onto frozen Montana ground, and there was no fence. The processing building was a long wooden structure with bare floors and fluorescent lights that flattened everything they touched into the same shadowless white. Clara stood in line and answered a young private's questions from a notepad. Her answers were precise and complete and gave him everything he needed and nothing more. Then Lieutenant Irene Holt came through the door. Holt was perhaps 34 with the posture of someone who had decided long ago that the world responded well to physical certainty. Her Women's Army Corps uniform was immaculate in a way that communicated sustained intention rather than simple habit. She moved through the room with the efficiency of a woman who had never confused motion with accomplishment, and she had apparently formed conclusions about each of the women in the room before any of them had opened their mouths. She stopped in front of Clara. Clara had known this moment was coming. She kept her expression neutral and her hands still. Holt reached into Clara's bag and removed a folded sheaf of papers. Clara had drawn them on the ship in the margins of a notebook she had been permitted to keep. 7 pages of careful pencil work. The coastline as glimpsed through the porthole. The roads traveled west from the port reconstructed from memory and the angle of the sun and the time elapsed between turns. The rough terrain of the final approach into Montana, the mountain profile, the probable river, the position of the nearest town. Everything assembled from observation and memory and the spatial reasoning that had been until 8 months ago her profession. She had not drawn them as an escape plan. She had drawn them because she could not look at a space without measuring it. Holt unfolded the papers and studied them. She studied them for a long time. Geographic materials are classified as strategic assets, Holt said. Prisoners are not permitted to retain them. It is a sketch from memory, Clara said carefully, not a document from any military source. That distinction is not the one that governs this. Holt rolled the papers and placed them in her jacket pocket. You will receive them back when permitted. Both of them understood that when permitted was a sentence without a conclusion. Clara held Holt's gaze. She did not argue further because arguing would not return the papers, and because she understood something about Lieutenant Irene Holt in that moment. This was a woman whose belief in correct procedure was total, and who had probably never seriously questioned whether correct procedure and sound judgment were the same thing. Engaging her further would give her additional information without changing any outcome. You will be assigned to Barracks 3, Holt said. Breakfast is at 6:30. Work assignment at 7:30. She looked at Clara the way people look at things they intend to monitor. Welcome to Camp Owens Marsh. She moved on. Clara stood in the flat white light and felt the particular weight of the loss. The maps had been her work, not military work, not intelligence work, just the product of a mind that organized the world through the relationship between distance and direction and the space existing between observed points. Taking them was not a security precaution. It was taking the one thing she had that was entirely and only hers. She filed it under unresolved and said nothing. The medical examination came the following morning. Dr. Samuel Finch was 52 years old. He had the face of a man sustaining himself through a specific act of change, the kind of will that did not draw attention to itself because it had been doing its work for a long time and had learned to operate quietly. He was thorough and precise, and he asked his questions in the flat, functional tone of someone who had long ago learned to keep the clinical and the personal in separate rooms. Clara answered everything accurately. Weight, general health injuries, prior conditions. She answered with the precision of someone accustomed to providing correct information in bureaucratic contexts. Then Finch looked up from his notepad. What was your occupation before the war? Cartographer. He wrote it down, a pause, then, which front did your unit support? Clara recognized the change in the nature of the question immediately. She had been answering administrative intake questions. This was something else. I am not in a position to answer that, she said. Finch looked at her. Not with hostility, not with calculation, with something heavier than either something that settled in his expression like sediment, carried a long way by moving water. He set his pen down. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked back at Clara. My son was in France, he said. Robert. He was 22 years old. He was killed at Normandy on June 8, 1944. He paused, not for effect, simply because the sentence required a pause. I have been trying to understand since then what the maps look like on the other side. What information was moving through systems like the one you worked in? I am not asking for intelligence. He said it quietly. I am asking because it is a question I cannot stop asking. The room was very quiet. Clara sat with that information and found that her usual organizational systems were not immediately available to her. She had frameworks for hostility and frameworks for false warmth and frameworks for the management of prisoners by people with institutional objectives. She did not have a framework for a man whose son had been dead for 5 months, who was sitting across from her in a small room in Montana and asking without accusation and without drama to understand what had happened. I supported the Western Front, she said after a moment. Positional mapping for a signals unit. I updated locations until there were no longer locations to update. Finch nodded. He wrote it down. Then he said simply, thank you. 2 words. They arrived with a weight that no judgment or condemnation would have matched. He finished the examination in silence. Clara left the room and stood in the corridor and did what she always did. She attempted to organize the experience into a structure she could work with. She found that Dr. Samuel Finch was resisting categorization in a way she had not previously encountered. She filed him under unresolved, the same category she had used for the cigarette on the ship. The unresolved column was getting longer. Margaret Crow was already seated at the far end of the dining table when Clara carried her tray into the hall that first evening. She was 55 years old with the settled, undemonstrative quality of someone who had spent decades inside rooms full of other people's noise and had learned to create within that noise a private and portable stillness. She had short gray hair and held her coffee cup in both hands with the ease of someone long accustomed to taking comfort in simple things without making a performance of it. She watched Clara cross the room, sit down, and begin organizing her tray with the precise efficiency Clara brought to any task. She watched this for a while in silence. Then she said in German, without preamble, "You are drawing the room." Clara looked up. "Not with a pen," Margaret said, "but in your head. The exits, the angles, the distances between things. You have been doing it since you walked in." She picked up her coffee. "I taught history in Berlin for 25 years. I learned to recognize the students who were genuinely paying attention. They are easy to identify because they are also, in my experience, the students most certain they already understand the answer before they have finished asking the question." Clara set down her fork. "I am not sure what you are suggesting." "The most honest cartographers who ever drew a map," Margaret said with the pleasant, unhurried tone of someone making an observation rather than a judgment, "were the ones who knew where the map ended. The ones who could look at the edge of what they had measured and draw those words honestly. Here is the boundary of what I know. Beyond this, something else." She looked at Clara without particular heat. The ones who filled in the blank spaces with their own assumptions and labeled them facts were drawing something certainly. But it was not a map of the territory. It was a map of their own expectations. She stood, collected her tray, and left. Clara sat at the long table in the lit dining hall and looked at the food in front of her. She was not accustomed to being addressed in a way that assumed she was doing something she had not noticed herself doing. She did not enjoy the experience. She ate and thought about it for a long time afterward. The first night at Camp Owens was the quietest night Clara Marsh had ever spent. Not quiet, silent. There is a difference, and the difference is physical. Quiet is the reduction of sound. Silence is the presence of its own weight pressing inward. The Montana night came through the windows of Barracks 3 with the insistent substance of something that occupied real space, and inside that space there was nothing. No traffic, no distant machinery, no artillery, which had been part of the atmospheric texture of her life for so long that its absence now felt like the removal of a wall she had stopped noticing was there. Clara lay in her bunk and looked at the ceiling. The bunk had a mattress, wool blankets, a small shelf at eye level. These registered and were filed. Outside Montana went on in every direction around the small lit camp, absolute and indifferent and very large. Ruth was in the bunk above her. After a long time, Ruth said into the dark, "There really is a no fence." No. Why? Clara had been building an answer to this question since the truck stopped. She laid it out now, not because Ruth had asked, but because speaking it aloud was a way of testing the structural integrity of the reasoning. First, she said, the wilderness functions as the barrier. The temperature, the distance, the terrain. In winter on foot without proper equipment, any attempt to reach the nearest town would fail before it succeeded. Not because of watchtowers, because the geography makes success improbable. Ruth was silent above her. Second, the local civilian population replaces the fence. In a small rural community, any unfamiliar face becomes visible within hours. A German woman without English, without papers, in a town of 2,000 people, in rural Montana in November, would be returned to this camp not out of hostility, but simply because everyone would know immediately that something was wrong. The silence outside pressed against the glass. Third, the absence of the fence is itself a mechanism. A fence produces a specific kind of resistance. The open boundary produces disorientation instead, and disorientation generates compliance more effectively than wire. Ruth was quiet for a moment. It still feels wrong. Yes, Clara said. Which part feels wrong to you? Clara considered this with genuine care. Not the absence of the fence. I have explanations for that. What I cannot explain is something underneath the explanations. Something whose outline I can measure but not yet name. Ruth said nothing. After a while, her breathing shifted into the slow, regular rhythm of sleep. Clara lay in the loudest silence she had ever heard and thought about maps. About the difference between the line drawn on paper and the ground the line was meant to represent. About what a map could carry and what it always inevitably left out. About a cigarette offered without expectation on the deck of a ship in the middle of the Atlantic. About a man with sediment in his eyes asking a question he could not stop asking. About a woman with gray hair who had said things Clara had not asked to hear and could not stop hearing now. About a column labeled unresolved that was longer than she was comfortable with. Outside, the Montana night continued without comment. The wooden posts at the camp perimeter stood in the darkness with nothing between them and the stars above the open land, and the space between each post was simply the world going on unmeasured in every direction. Clara closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a very long time. The dog decided before anyone else did. On the third morning at Camp Owens, a guard walked Clara and Ruth and 6 other women to a truck idling outside the administrative building. The rancher they were assigned to was named Howard Whitfield. His property sat 10 miles north on a dirt road that cut through open fields, still carrying the last pale color of autumn grass. The mountains to the west were closer from the ranch than from the camp, their lower slopes dark with pine, their upper ridges white, the peaks folded into low cloud. The ranch was large and functional and built without any interest in being impressive. A main house, a barn, several outbuildings, fenced pasture where cattle stood in the cold morning air, with the patient self-sufficiency of animals that had nowhere particular to be. Howard Whitfield was waiting by the barn. He was perhaps 50, weathered by outdoor work in cold climates for so long that the weathering had become simply his face communicating nothing beyond the general expectation that the day's tasks would be completed. He looked at the group and assigned work through gesture and a few words that Corporal Bram translated into approximate German. And then the dog came around the corner of the barn. He was perhaps 4 years old, broad-chested, the color of dried grass, with the alert and slightly skeptical expression of an animal that has learned through experience to form accurate first impressions. He slowed when he saw the group of women. He looked at them. His posture shifted into something between uncertainty and mild displeasure, and a low sound began in his chest that was not quite a growl, but was definitely a warning. He moved along the edge of the group with that sound running under his breath, and each woman stepped back slightly as he passed. Then he reached Clara. He stopped. The sound stopped. He looked up at her for a long moment with his amber eyes, his head slightly tilted as though she had presented him with a problem he found interesting. Then, with the unhurried decisiveness of an animal that trusts its own conclusions, he sat down beside her. Just like that, not beside the group, beside her specifically. Edmund Tate, the ranch hand, who would be supervising their work, had been watching this from the doorway of the barn. He was 30 years old, built for sustained physical effort rather than for display, and he spoke with the economy of someone who had long ago decided that words were most useful when they carried weight. He looked at the dog sitting beside Clara. He looked at Clara. He knows people, Edmund said. Then he went into the barn to begin the morning's work. Clara looked down at the dog. The dog looked up at her. She did not know what to do with this information, so she filed it in the same place she had been filing, everything she could not categorize, and followed the others into the barn. His name, she learned later, was Gus. Howard Whitfield did not speak to the prisoners directly. Not at first. This was not hostility exactly, it was something more considered. He moved through the working day in a way that accommodated their presence without acknowledging it, the way a careful man moves around something he has been asked to accept, but has not yet decided how to feel about. He communicated through Edmund, who communicated through Bram, who translated into the approximate German he had assembled from a phrase sheet in several weeks of practice. Clara noticed the way Howard checked the latch on the north side of the hay storage after the group left that area each day. Not obviously, not with any accusatory intent. Just a hand on the metal, a brief confirming pressure, and then on to the next task. She recognized this. She had seen it before in different contexts and different languages. It was the behavior of a man operating from a specific assumption about what kind of people he was dealing with. The assumption was not malicious. It was simply there, the way a fixed point on a map is simply there organizing everything around it. She did not resent it. She understood it. And she continued to work with the same precision and reliability she brought to everything. Not to change his assessment, but because working well was what she did regardless of who was watching. The change came in the second week on a morning when the cold was sharp and the ground had frozen overnight into something closer to stone than earth. Clara was passing the eastern side of the barn when she heard a sound from the far calf stall. A young animal, its voice carrying the particular note of distress that is distinct from ordinary complaint. She stopped and looked through the gap in the planking and saw a calf perhaps 3 weeks old pressed into the corner of a stall whose door had swung partially closed at an odd angle, the bottom rail jammed against a frozen ridge in the floor. Howard was there, one shoulder against the door, his face set with the controlled frustration of a man working a physical problem that should have a simple answer. The door would not open more than a third of the way. The calf could not get out. His hands were too large for the angle, and the latch mechanism had frozen in a position that required a specific leverage point from inside the stall that he could not reach. Clara came around the corner of the barn. She looked at the door, at the frozen floor ridge, at the latch housing, at the angle of Howard's body relative to where the actual binding point was. She crossed to the other side of the frame, positioned her hand at a different point on the door rail, and applied pressure downward at an angle while simultaneously pushing the latch housing sideways with her thumb. The door opened. The calf walked out and went directly to its mother in the adjacent stall. Howard looked at the door. He looked at the way Clara had positioned herself to open it. He looked at Clara. She was already walking back to her assigned area. He said nothing. But that afternoon, for the first time, he did not check the north latch. There was a library in the camp. The word was generous for what it actually was, a single room with 2 shelves, a wooden table, and a lamp that worked when it felt like it. But the books were real, and among them, on the lower shelf, toward the left end, was a road atlas of the United States. Clara found it on her 4th evening and carried it to the table. She had been building the map in her head since the truck from the port. Now she placed the mental version against the printed one and checked her measurements. The nearest town, Milford, was 13 miles south, not the 14 she had estimated. The river she had inferred from the eastern vegetation was the Judith, running east to west approximately 8 miles north of the camp. The nearest rail connection was 40 miles to the southeast. She worked through the numbers quietly. On foot in winter without proper equipment, with clothing that was sufficient for the barracks and inadequate for open ground, the tree line was reachable. The river was not under current conditions. The town was theoretically reachable in extreme circumstances, but would offer nothing. A woman with no English and no papers in a town of 2,000 people in rural Montana in November would be visible before she crossed the first intersection. The wilderness was the fence. She had known this. Now she had confirmed it. She closed the atlas and sat with it in her lap for a moment. Ruth came in from the corridor, a library copy of a farming almanac under her arm. She stopped when she saw Claire at the table. Looking for something, checking my measurements. Were you right? Mostly. Clara set the atlas on the table and looked at it. 13 miles, not 14. Ruth sat down across from her. Does it help knowing the exact distance? Clara thought about this with genuine honesty. It should. Ruth waited. It tells me where the fence is, Clara said. It does not tell me why they are not worried about it. She stood and put the atlas back on the shelf and walked back to the barracks in the dark. The letter from her mother arrived at the end of November. Munich was damaged but standing. The apartment on Schiller Street had lost its upper floor, but the lower 2 remained. Her mother was managing. That word came carrying its specific weight, the weight of a word chosen because the more accurate words were too large or too dangerous to put on paper. Clara read the letter twice and placed it under her mattress. That evening at dinner, Ruth was already at the table when Clara sat down. Ruth looked at her, read whatever was on her face, and was quiet for a moment. Bad news. My mother is managing. Ruth was still. She understood the word. Mine also in her last letter. from the basement because the upper floors are open to the sky. She wrote that she can see stars from her bed and called it a kind of luxury. Clara looked at her. There was nothing to say that would not make it smaller, so she said nothing. They ate the soup. It was thick and hot, and there was real bread. The soup is good tonight, Ruth said after a while. Yes, Clara said. Neither of them said the rest of it. That good soup in a warm room while their mothers navigated ruined apartments in a country that had lost the war was its own kind of distance. Not measured in miles, measured in something that did not have a unit. Edmund Tate looked at the sky on a Wednesday afternoon and said without drama, "Storm Thursday, heavier than they forecast." He said it the way he said most things, which was as an item of information, rather than as an occasion for concern. He went back to stacking the lumber he had been stacking. Clara heard it. She filed it. She said nothing. The storm arrived Thursday morning while the group was already at the ranch. It came from the north with the patient accumulated weight of weather that has made up its mind. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in an hour. By mid-morning, the road back to camp had disappeared under 8 inches of new snow and was adding to itself steadily. They were not going anywhere. Howard took stock of the situation with the brief efficiency of a man who had weathered Montana winters for 20 years. The group would stay until the road was passable. Edmund agreed with this. Bram agreed with this. Francis Whitfield, who had apparently been aware that this possibility existed before anyone else acknowledged it, already had coffee on the stove and was portioning out the work of the kitchen without being asked. The problem arrived in the early afternoon. One of Howard's breeding bulls, a substantial animal worth more than Clara wanted to estimate, had not returned from the northeast pasture before the storm came in. The drift in the low field was building fast. The temperature was continuing to drop. If the animal was in the open when the cold reached its worst point, the loss would be significant. Howard wanted to go. Edmund agreed that someone should go. The difficulty was that the trail through the northeast fields was not visible in the new snow, and the pasture system had 3 subsections that merged in confusing ways when the boundary markers were covered. Edmund knew the main routes. He did not know the specific grazing pattern of the morning well enough to choose without information he did not have. Clara was standing at the kitchen door when this conversation happened, waiting for the temperature to lift enough to make the outdoor work viable again. She listened. She had been measuring this terrain for 6 weeks, not because she intended to go anywhere, not as a plan, because she could not stop measuring things she looked at. She crossed the kitchen to the table. She looked at the surface of it, then she began to draw with her finger, not on paper, on the table itself. The motion was unhurried and exact. The main barn as the central reference point, the fence line running northeast from there. The depression she had noticed in the eastern field, which in her observation of how cattle moved over 6 weeks, suggested the lowest point in that section, the natural shelter where animals went when weather came in. The specific angle relative to the large maple at the edge of the eastern fence, a bearing she had noted without choosing to, because it was the kind of spatial detail her mind collected automatically. Agnes Crawford was sitting at the kitchen table. Agnes was 38, a former school teacher from Cologne who had been holding functional English since before the war, and had been dispensing it in careful portions ever since. She watched what Clara was drawing on the table, and her expression shifted. "You have never been to that part of the field," Agnes said. "No. If you are wrong, he could die out there." Clara looked at Agnes directly. "Yes, that is why I said the judgment is his." Howard was watching the drawing from the doorway. He looked at the angle, the depression, the bearing to the maple tree. He looked at Edmund. Edmund looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then he looked at the sky through the kitchen window, reading it the way he read everything, taking information from what it was doing rather than from what it said. He took his coat from the peg by the door. "I will go that way." 40 minutes later, they came back through the kitchen door. Edmund's coat was white to the shoulders. Behind him, Howard was leading the bull, who was very large and entirely unconcerned about any of it. No one said anything remarkable. Francis put more coffee on. Edmund hung his coat. Howard took the bull to the barn and came back and sat at the table and picked up his cup. He looked at Clara across the kitchen briefly with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not warmth exactly, something more precise than warmth. A recalibration. Gus came in from the barn, shook snow from his coat, and laid down on the kitchen floor near Clara's feet. Agnes said nothing to Clara for the rest of the afternoon. The storm lasted 3 days. The road to camp disappeared and stayed disappeared. The snow came down with the patient consistency of weather that has made no promises about stopping. The boundary posts at the camp perimeter, visible in the distance, were buried to their midpoints by the end of the first day. Clara spent the storm in Howard's small study, which contained 4 shelves of books, a road atlas she had already seen, and a collection of agricultural records going back 20 years, that she found unexpectedly interesting for their documentation of weather patterns and soil behavior across the county. She worked through them with the same methodical attention she would have brought to any set of data. On the second afternoon, Ruth came in with a copy of a National Geographic magazine and sat across from her at the desk. They read in silence for a while. The lamp made a circle of yellow light that held both of them. Outside, the snow continued without comment. Ruth set the magazine down. "Why aren't they worried?" she said. Clara looked up. "About us. About any of it." Ruth was looking at the lamp, not at Clara. 6 weeks, and I have not once seen an American guard look genuinely concerned about where we are or what we are doing. Edmund works alongside us as though we are hired hands he has known for years. Francis feeds us as though we are neighbors who stop by. Even the guards at the camp, at night, they are watchful but not frightened. They are not afraid of us. She paused. "Why?" "The terrain," Clara said. "I know the terrain." Ruth looked at her then. "You explained it the first night. I have thought about it every day since. The logic holds." She paused. "But when I watch Frances pour coffee for whoever is at her table, I do not see someone executing a psychological operation. I see someone who pours coffee for whoever is at her table. That is precisely what a well-executed operation looks like." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Clara," she said the name carefully, "at what point does something that is indistinguishable from genuine become genuine?" The lamp burned. Outside, the snow went on. Clara looked at the atlas on the corner of the desk. She had measured the distances. She had confirmed the hypotheses. She had done the work she knew how to do. And Ruth's question was sitting in the room with them now, neither asking for agreement nor willing to be dismissed, simply occupying space with the stubborn weight of something that had been true long before it was spoken. She did not answer. Ruth picked up her magazine and went back to reading. On the third morning of the storm, when the snow had slowed to intermittent and the sky had lightened from white to gray, Frances Whitfield came into the kitchen, where Clara was sitting with a cup of coffee and set a folded sheet of paper on the table. It was a county survey map, a real one printed by a government survey office, accurate and current with elevation markings and water features, and the road network rendered in enough detail to be genuinely useful. Frances opened it flat on the table and pointed to a location near the center. "Here." She looked at Clara. Clara looked at the map. She oriented it north, automatically found the river, traced the road network. Located the camp, located the ranch, located Milford to the south. The scale was good. Her estimates had been accurate. Frances was watching her face. "You read maps," Frances said. "I make them," Clara said carefully in English. Frances's expression shifted. Not surprise. The specific adjustment of someone who has been carrying one version of a person in their mind and now has to revise it. She went to the drawer beneath the kitchen counter and came back with a second book. It was a world atlas, old, its spine soft from use. She opened it to a double-page spread of the world and set it beside the county map. Clara found Germany. She found Montana. She placed 2 fingers, one on each location. Frances looked at the distance between them. She looked for a long time with the focus of someone taking a measurement they had not previously thought to take. "Long way to come," she said. No irony, no agenda. The plain observation of someone looking at a map and noting what it showed. Clara sat with one finger on Montana and looked at the space between that point and the other. She had measured this distance before in kilometers and nautical miles in days aboard a ship. She had never looked at it as simply this 2 points on a surface and all the unremarkable world lying between them. "Yes," Clara said. "Long way." Frances nodded and went back to the stove. Clara sat at the kitchen table with the world atlas open in front of her and looked at the map for a long time after Frances had returned to her work. The routine medical check in late November brought Clara back to Dr. Finch's examining room. He cleaned a splinter wound on her right hand, a piece of lumber from the woodpile that had gone in at an angle she had not noticed until it had already been there for 2 days. He worked with the same focused efficiency he brought to every examination. "This will heal quickly," he said. The same words he used about every minor wound, and they were always correct. He was wrapping the bandage when he set down the medical tape and looked at the middle distance for a moment. "There is something I have been wanting to ask," he said. Clara waited. "The unit you supported, the signals unit, when a front began to collapse, what happened to the positional maps? Were they transmitted back or destroyed in the field?" She recognized the question was not administrative. She had answered his administrative questions in the first examination. This was different in texture, quieter, carrying something underneath it that the surface words did not fully contain. "Transmitted when possible," she said. "Destroyed when transmission was not possible." Finch was quiet for a moment. He picked up the tape again and finished the bandage. "My son Robert was in France," he said. "He was a first lieutenant with the 29th Infantry. He was killed on June 8th at a road junction outside a village called Formigny. He spoke with the practiced flatness of a man who has said a thing so many times that the words have worn smooth, their edges gone, leaving only their shape and weight. He was 22 years old. He had been in Europe for 4 months. Clara held still. I have been thinking since then about the other side of those maps, Finch said. About the people in the rooms where the positions were plotted and updated and corrected. Whether they looked like anything in particular. Whether they were young or old, frightened or certain. Whether any of them understood what the lines on the paper corresponded to on the actual ground. He put his instruments away with careful, methodical movements. I understood, Clara said after a moment. In the abstract, professional way of someone who works with numbers. The numbers represented deaths of people I had never met. I continued updating them because the alternative was a space I had no map for. Finch looked at her. I'm sorry about your son, Clara said. She said it because it was true, and it was the only true thing available to say. Finch was quiet for the long moment. Thank you, Marsh. He said it the way he said everything, precisely without performance. He stood and opened the door. Clara walked out into the corridor and stood there and found that the unresolved column had changed shape again, become something heavier and more specific. No longer a list of things she could not categorize, but a single sustained weight she was going to have to carry without knowing yet what to do with it. On a Tuesday morning in the second week of December, Margaret Crow was not at breakfast. Clara noticed before she sat down. She had grown accustomed to Margaret's particular location at the end of the table, the way she held her coffee cup, the quality of attention she directed at the room without appearing to direct it at anything. Agnes Crawford, who knew more about the internal workings of the camp than most, was quiet when Clara asked. Then there is a medical repatriation list. Women with prior health conditions who qualify for early transfer. Dr. Finch identified several cases. Crow was on it. Heart. Clara sat with her food and thought about this. That evening, she found Margaret in the barracks folding the few items she was permitted to take into a small canvas bag. The process was orderly and unhurried. Margaret looked up when Clara came in. I heard this morning, Clara said. Yes? Margaret straightened a collar, placed the garment in the bag. It is abrupt. I apologize for not telling you myself. You did not owe me notice. No. Margaret looked at her steadily. But we have been talking even when we were not speaking. That counts for something. She folded another item. How is the unresolved column? Clara was quiet for a moment, growing. Margaret almost smiled. Good. She closed the bag. The most useful maps I have ever seen were the ones where the cartographer was willing to leave blank space and label it honestly. Everything we do not know yet. Everything that requires more information before it can be named. She lifted the bag. You are, I think, getting closer to the edge of what you were measuring when you arrived. When you reach it, you will need a different kind of attention than the kind you came in with. She walked past Clara and out the door. Clara stood in the empty barracks for a while. The December cold came through the walls with the slow, methodical insistence of something that intended to be present regardless of what it was asked to do. She thought about blank space on a map. She thought about the line where measurement ended and something else began, something that did not yet have a name. She thought about Ruth's question still sitting in her chest like a splinter she had not found yet. At what point does something indistinguishable from genuine become genuine? She did not have an answer. She had frameworks. She had hypotheses. She had the distances measured and confirmed and filed. And somewhere at the northern edge of the ranch, land 300 meters from the camp boundary, the tree line stood dark against the December sky, and whatever existed beyond it was too large to measure from where she was standing. She went back to her bunk and lay down and looked at the ceiling and listened to the Montana night pressing in from all directions, complete and without opinion, waiting for her to figure out what kind of map she was actually trying to make. December arrived and stayed. The cold that settled over Montana in those weeks was not the cold of a single bad night. It was a cold with intention, a cold that had decided to be present in the walls of the barracks, in the corners of rooms, and in the specific effort required each morning to wash your face in water that came out of the tap as something only technically still liquid. Clara converted the temperatures she saw on the mess hall thermometer automatically, the numbers appearing in her mind, already translated from Fahrenheit, and what the numbers told her was something she had never experienced in Munich. She was becoming accustomed to it. That was the thing she had not anticipated. She raised it with Ruth one evening walking back from the mess hall, their breath coming in visible clouds in the dark air between them. The routine is working on us, she said. That is its function, not to organize the day, to reduce resistance by making the day feel ordinary. Ruth walked beside her with her hands deep in her coat pockets. And you would prefer what instead disorder? I would prefer to remain clear about what this is. I know what this is, Ruth said. Cold and far from home, and the coffee is genuinely good. I can hold all of those things in the same hand. She was quiet for a moment. You treat clarity as though it were the same thing as safety. They are not the same thing. She went inside. Clara stood on the path for a moment. The sky above the camp was extraordinary in the absence of city light, more stars than she had ever seen from any place she had lived, before the band of the galaxy visible as something you felt as much as saw. The boundary posts stood at the edge of the lamplight, and beyond them was the darkness of the open ground, and beyond that the darkness of the tree line, and beyond that the mountains invisible but present. She went inside and lay on her bunk and thought about what Ruth had said until she stopped thinking about it. It was Gus who warned them. The afternoon was overcast, the light flat and white across the ranch yard, the kind of afternoon that compressed distance and made everything seem closer than it was. Clara was moving timber from the south stack to the covered storage with two other women when Gus came around the corner of the barn at a run. He stopped in the middle of the yard and began barking with the specific urgency of an animal communicating something rather than simply making noise. Edmund stopped what he was doing. He looked at the direction Gus was facing toward the eastern fence, and his posture changed into something attentive and still. The deer came through the fence at a gap between two posts. It was a large mule deer, moving with the disoriented speed of an animal that had been frightened into running without knowing where to run. It came into the yard at an angle that would take it directly through the group of women near the timber stack. Gus moved before anyone else did. He ran directly at the deer, not in the aggressive straight line of a dog attacking, but at an angle cutting across his path, barking steadily, using his body to redirect. The deer veered. Gus cut again. The deer changed direction a second time and went back through the fence gap it had entered by and disappeared into the eastern field. The yard was quiet. Clara realized she had not moved. She had been standing with a length of timber in both hands, watching the dog work, and the timber was still in her hands, and she had not moved an inch. Gus trotted back to the center of the yard, breathing hard, his tongue out, and looked around at the group the way a professional looks around after completing a task to make sure nothing else requires attention. Then he came to where Clara was standing and sat down beside her and leaned his side against her leg. Edmund looked at this and then looked at the fence gap and then looked at the sky. He went to repair the gap without a word. Clara set the timber down carefully and looked at the dog leaning against her. She understood the mechanics of what had just happened. She understood animal behavior and territorial instinct and the way a ranch dog learned to manage livestock movement. She understood all of the mechanisms. She also understood that Gus had run towards something that frightened other animals in order to put himself between it and the people standing behind him, and that he had come back and chosen out of all the places available to him in the yard to lean against her specifically. She did not put her hand on his head. She was not a person who made gestures before she knew what she meant by them. But she stood there and let him lean, and after a while she picked up the timber again and went back to work, and Gus got up and followed her to the woodpile and lay down a few feet away and watched her work for the rest of the afternoon. Lieutenant Holt came to the ranch on a morning in late December. Clara saw her arrive in a separate vehicle while the group was working in the north yard. She watched Holt speak with Bram near the barn door. She watched Bram's posture and the angle of Holt's attention, and she understood before Holt crossed the yard that this was not a routine inspection. Holt stopped in front of her. "Walk with me." They walked to the edge of the north yard where the ranch fence met the open pasture. Holt stood with her back to the wind and looked at Clara with the expression she always wore, the expression of someone who had arrived at conclusions and was now in the business of confirming them. "You directed Howard Whitfield and Edmund Tate into a specific area of the northeast pasture during the storm last week," Holt said, "without authorization, without permission. You made a tactical decision about the movement of American civilians based on geographic analysis you are not permitted to conduct." Clara kept her expression level. "Mr. Whitfield asked for information. I provided it. He made his own decision. You provided geographic intelligence derived from 6 weeks of unsanctioned terrain observation." Holt's voice was precisely controlled. "Prisoners are not permitted to collect or act on geographic intelligence. You know this." "I provided a direction and a landmark," Clara said, "based on observation of where cattle moved when weather came in. That is not military intelligence. That is attention." "It is not what you observed," Holt said. "It is that you were observing it all. Every day you are out here, you are building a model of this terrain. You have been doing it since the truck stopped in this camp. You are the most situationally aware prisoner in this facility, possibly the most situationally aware person on this property, and I do not know what to do with that fact except to tell you that I am watching you." She said the last part without particular heat. She said it the way someone states something they believe is true and necessary to communicate regardless of how it lands. Clara looked at her. "I cannot stop measuring things I look at. It is the same compulsion that made me useful to my unit. It does not stop because the context changes." Holt was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the fence line. No, she said finally. I suppose it does not. She turned and walked back toward the barn. At the edge of the yard, she paused without turning around. Do not give me a reason to put you in administrative restriction, Marsh. I am not looking for one. But if you give me one, I will use it. She continued walking. Clara stood at the fence line and looked at the pasture, the snow-covered ground running to the tree line that was now familiar to her in the specific way that places become familiar when you have looked at them from the same direction every working day for weeks. She thought about what Holt had said. She thought about the fact that Holt was correct in her description and had no idea what that correctness meant or did not mean. She went back to work. In January, the language shifted. Clara had been absorbing English since the shipbuilding, the way she built everything through accumulated observation and structural analysis. She had understood more than she had communicated from the first week. Now, somewhere in the slow middle of January, she realized she had stopped translating. The English arrived directly without the German intermediate step she had been using without noticing. She was receiving information in the language it was delivered in and responding from the same place. This changed things in ways she had not predicted. She read American newspapers in the camp library, not for language practice, for content. The coverage of the war in its final months had a specific register. She had not expected, not triumphalist, not the tone of a country celebrating victory, but the tone of a country that was very tired and had understood, apparently, that what it had been through was not a simple thing and did not have a simple meaning. One letter to the editor in a Montana paper was from a woman whose son had been killed in France. The letter was not angry at the Germans. It was angry at war itself, the exhausted anger of someone who had given something irreplaceable and was still trying in the specific way of someone who has been trying for a long time to understand what it had been given for. Clara read it twice. She thought about her brother still in uniform, still somewhere she had not received a letter from since October. She folded the newspaper along its crease and sat with it in her lap for a while. Then she went back to the barracks and wrote a letter to her mother in Munich, and in the letter she did not use the word managing. Dr. Finch came to find her. This was unusual. The examinations happened on a schedule and in his room. Finding her in the administrative corridor on a Thursday afternoon was outside the established pattern, and Finch was a man who did not deviate from established patterns without a reason. He had a photograph in his hand. He said, I would like to show you something if you are willing. They went to his examination room and sat on opposite sides of his desk, which was the first time Clara had sat across from him rather than on the examination table. He placed the photograph on the desk between them. A young man in American uniform, 22 or 23 years old, squinting slightly against what looked like autumn light. He had the directness of his father in his eyes and something else, something that had not yet been worn into the flat surfaces that long experience produced in men of his father's age. Robert, Finch said, October 1943, 8 months before France. Clara looked at the photograph. He wrote good letters, Finch said, not long ones. He was never a long writer, but the ones he sent said things accurately. He described what he saw without exaggerating it. That is harder to do than most people realize. He looked at his son's face for a moment. When I received the last official communication, I was in the middle of an appointment. I finished the appointment. I saw 3 more patients that afternoon. I filed the paperwork at the end of the day. He paused. I did not know what else to do. Clara held the weight of that in the silence between them. I want to ask you something, Finch said. And I want you to know before you answer that I am not asking for any purpose other than the one I am about to state. I have been treating women from your country for 2 months. I have been trying in whatever time remains in the working day to understand what the inside of that country looked like during the time my son was outside it. Not the official version, the daily version. What a person experienced moving through it. Clara looked at him across his desk. I updated positions, she said. I maintained records of where units were and where they were moving. In the last year, what I was recording was a retreat. I knew it in the professional way, the same way you would know a patient's condition was deteriorating from the numbers in a chart. I updated the charts because that was my work. Were you frightened? Finch asked. She considered the question with genuine honesty. I was occupied. Frightened requires enough space to feel it in. We did not have that space. Finch was quiet for a moment. He picked up the photograph and looked at his son's face. I hope someone was kind to him, he said. Over there, wherever he was. He said it the way a person says something they have said many times silently and are saying aloud now because they have decided to trust the room enough to let it out. Clara thought about the cigarette on the ship, about Edmund saying good work in the flat, true way of someone for whom it was simply true, about Corporal Bram and all the things she had not yet arrived at but was going to arrive at. I think someone probably was, she said. Not because I have evidence, because it is what people do in most cases when they are given the space to choose it. Finch set the photograph down. He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back at him. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, the same words he had said before, but carrying a different weight, this time the weight of something given rather than received. He stood. She stood. She walked out of his office and into the January cold of the corridor and felt the unresolved column in her mind shift, not close, but change shape, become something less like an open question and more like an answer she was still learning how to hold. On a Sunday afternoon in December, Ruth did not come back from the barn. Clara was stacking timber with Agnes near the south fence when she noticed. She had last seen Ruth 40 minutes earlier, sent to bring feed sacks from the north end of the storage. She looked toward the barn now. The yard door was closed. She kept stacking timber. 20 minutes more. She set down the length of wood in her hands and walked to the barn and opened the door. The feed sacks were in their place on the north side undisturbed. The far door, the one that faced north toward the tree line, was standing open. In the snow outside the far door, one set of footprints, small boots. Heading north, already partly filled by the wind. Clara stood in the open doorway and looked at the footprints and at the tree line and at the sky above the trees. She had the distances memorized without effort. 300 meters to the first trees. Beyond that, the forest interior, lodgepole pine dark and close together, the floor invisible from here. She knew the temperature. She knew the light remaining. She knew the weight of the numbers and what they meant for a 19-year-old girl from Stuttgart who had never been anywhere. She also knew something she had not known 6 weeks ago, which was that she was afraid. Not of consequence, not of punishment or of what would happen to herself. Afraid for Ruth in the specific irreducible way that one person is afraid for another when they have come to matter in the particular way that Ruth had come to matter, not as a category or a responsibility, but as an individual whose continued existence had become something Clara's system included. Because they built something worth coming back to, Clara said. And they know it. The room was silent. Outside, the Montana night continued cold and clear and very large, and the boundary posts stood in the darkness with nothing between them and the extraordinary field of stars above the open land, and somewhere to the south the lights of Milford were too small and too far to be visible, but present as they always were at the edge of what could be measured. Clara closed her eyes. The framework was not broken. She had not been wrong about the individual measurements. The terrain was the fence and the distance was real, and the cold was real. Every calculation she had done was accurate. She had simply been measuring the wrong thing. The fence had never been the point. The point was what they had built on the other side of it, in the confidence they carried. A confidence that did not announce itself, that lived in the way. A ranch hand said, "Good work," and a guard received 3 hours without asking why. And a doctor showed you a photograph that whatever they had made here was worth the trouble of choosing to stay inside it. She slept. The war ended on a Tuesday morning in May. Clara was filing documents in the administrative building when the guard said something to the officer at the desk. The officer set his pen down. He looked at the window for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara. "Germany surrendered," he said. Clara was holding a folder she had been about to file. She held it for a while. Then she set it on the correct stack and walked outside. The Montana sky was enormous and blue. The mountains to the west had lost their snow down to the tree line. The camp was very quiet. Gus appeared from somewhere and sat down beside her without being invited, which was by now simply what he did. Ruth found her. They stood together in the morning sun without speaking for a long time. "It is finished," Ruth said. "Yes. What do you think it looks like at home?" Clara thought about the apartment on Schiller Street with its missing upper floor. About her mother's word, the one that contained multitudes. About her brother, from whom a letter had arrived in March alive in an American holding facility in Bavaria, expected for release within months. "I think it looks like beginning," she said, very slowly, "with whatever is left." Ruth looked at the mountains. "I keep thinking about the fences, not the one that is missing here. The ones we had, all of them, around everything." She was quiet. "They kept us in, but they also kept us from seeing what was on the other side. What other things looked like. What other ways of doing anything felt like from the inside." She paused. "I did not know a country could run on trust until I stood inside one that did." Clara looked at the boundary posts, the same posts that had been there in November. The same open gaps. The spring grass was coming up on the other side, small and green, and entirely committed to being there. "Neither did I," she said. On the last day at the ranch, Frances made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table with the county survey map between them, which had become, by that point, simply the way they sat together. The map, a habit neither of them had formally decided to continue. They talked about ordinary things, the summer weather, the cattle, the Alderson family to the north who had decided to stay after all. Then Frances said Robert came home in April. Clara looked at her. He is in Ohio with his sister for the summer. He is well. Frances held her cup with both hands. He said the German people he met seemed tired. He said they seemed like people who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. Yes, Clara said, that is accurate. He said someone was kind to him over there, Frances said. In the last months before it was over, a family outside a town whose name he could not pronounce. He said they gave him food and did not ask questions. He said he has thought about it often. Clara looked at the map on the table. I wanted you to know, Frances said simply. Clara thought about Dr. Finch and his son's photograph, and the 2 words he had said when she told him that people do what decency asks of them when they are given the space to choose it. She thought about the kind of information that travels in only one direction if you are not careful, from judgment to conclusion, from assumption to fact, from the map you came in with to the territory that refuses to match it. I am glad, Clara said, and meant it without any structure underneath it, without any framework holding it up. It stood on its own. Gus was asleep under the table with his head on Clara's foot. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Frances. May I ask something? Of course. The maps, Clara said. The county survey. Could I keep it? Frances looked at her for a moment. Then she stood and went to the drawer where she kept the atlases and came back with the county survey and a second map, a state survey more detailed, covering a larger area. She set both on the table. Take them both. Clara folded them carefully along their original creases and placed them in her bag. She thought about what she would do with maps of a Montana county and Munich. Maps were how she kept places. A map was the record of having been somewhere and having paid attention. She had paid attention here. She left Camp Owens on a Tuesday morning in August. Bus to Billings. Train east across the country. 3 days through the American interior, moving past the window, the scale of it that she had found incomprehensible in October, now organized in her mind by experience, by 8 months of measuring from the inside rather than from above. In New York, she boarded a ship in September. She stood on the deck as the harbor opened up and looked at the city behind the port. It was simply what it was. She looked at it with attention and without suspicion and without the need to find the mechanism behind each thing she saw. The ship moved out into the Atlantic. She went below. Munich in October was cold and gray, and in the process of becoming something it had not previously been, the damage distributed through it not uniformly, but in the specific pattern of things that fall from height, whole blocks beside cleared rubble. The cathedral standing and the street beside it, a gap. Her mother was in the apartment. The reunion was quiet. Her mother had become smaller in the way that people become smaller when the structures they lived inside have collapsed, not in their physical dimensions, but in something that used to fill the space around them. She was managing. Clara knew now with complete precision what that word held and what it did not, and she understood that the time for that word was not over, but that there was work ahead of it. They sat at a smaller table than the original having been converted to firewood in the last winter of the war, and drank tea and looked at each other. America, her mother said, not a question. Yes. Her mother searched for the rest of the sentence. Was it? It was not what we were told, Clara said. Her mother looked at her tea. Nothing was, she said. She found work in the spring of 1946 with the American Occupation Authority, which needed German speakers with genuine English. She presented herself with her discharge papers and her 9 months of language, built in a camp library and a ranch kitchen in Montana, and she was offered a position on the same day. She drew maps of Munich. She drew the damage and the intact sections and the places where the two met, all with the same precision she had always brought to spatial problems, but with something added that had not been there before: the knowledge of the difference between a map and the ground it was meant to represent. What the line on paper contained and what it inevitably left out. She had learned this in Montana, and it made her better at the work. In the summer of 1951, she received a letter from Ruth in Stuttgart, brief, ordinary in its texture, the reconstruction progress. A new job in a textile office, a neighbor's garden that had come back unexpectedly well. At the end, I still think about the coffee, Frances's kitchen, the way she poured it without checking whether you wanted it. I have never been able to explain to any or responsibility, but as an individual whose continued existence had become something Clara's system included without having been asked. She closed the barn door and went back to the timber pile and continued working. She did not tell anyone for 2 hours. She worked and thought about this. She moved wood from one stack to another and looked at the question directly: why was she waiting? She examined the answer with the same precision she brought to everything. She was waiting because there was still time. She was waiting because the terrain was the fence and the fence was doing its work, and Ruth was 19 and cold but not frail. She was waiting because something in her had understood without consulting the frameworks she had constructed over a lifetime of living inside a specific kind of system, that telling here was not the same act as telling there, that the space between what she had seen and what she would report was not disloyalty. It was judgment. And for the first time in 26 years of navigating the world, she was being asked to decide whether her judgment was something she trusted. She placed another piece of wood. She decided that it was. The third hour arrived. The light was going. The temperature had moved past difficult into something the body registered without ambiguity. Clara's hands were rigid inside her gloves. The tree line was dark now, the individual trees merged into one continuous edge, the interior of the forest invisible. She set down the timber she was holding. She walked to Corporal Bram. "Ruth Calloway has been gone 3 hours," she said. Her tracks went north from the barn's far door toward the tree line. Bram looked at her. Something moved in his expression, not anger, not alarm, but a brief and focused attention coming to bear on a specific problem. 3 hours, he said, not a question, a piece of information he was absorbing. Clara held his gaze and waited. She was waiting for the question that in every context she had ever known would come first. Why did you wait? The question whose answer determined what happened next to the person who had waited. He did not ask it. He called Edmund over from the far side of the yard. Clara stood in the cold air and felt the absence of that question in the way you feel a door that should have had weight and did not completely physically with your whole body. He had simply received the information. 3 hours was a piece of data. What she had done with those 3 hours was hers. He had not asked because he had apparently assumed she had reasons, and he had assumed apparently that her reasons were her own business. Lieutenant Holt was at the edge of the yard conducting her end-of-day review when this happened. Clara saw her watching. When Bram and Edmund began moving toward the tree line, Holt walked across the yard to Clara. She stopped close enough that her voice would not carry to the others. 3 hours, Holt said. Yes, you watched her go. Clara said nothing. She had not watched Ruth go. She had found the evidence that Ruth had gone. The distinction was real and would mean nothing to Holt right now. In any other posting I have served in, Holt said, waiting 3 hours before reporting an escape attempt would be grounds for formal action. She was quiet for a moment. Bram did not ask you why. No, Clara said. Holt looked at her. Not with anger now, not even with the monitoring attention she usually carried. With something closer to a woman encountering a situation her training had not provided language for. I cannot decide, Holt said quietly, whether what just happened is a problem or not. She stepped back. Do not make me decide, Marsh. She returned to her vehicle. Clara went back to the timber pile. She worked and thought about telling. She had grown up inside a system in which the act of reporting was woven into daily life so completely that it required no decision, only compliance. The system needed information to function, and you provided it, and the interval between observation and report was where deviation lived, and deviation was what happened when individuals decided their own judgment outweighed the structure. She had waited 3 hours because the structure here was not built the same way. The guard who had not asked why she waited was operating from a premise she had never previously inhabited, the premise that the interval between what she saw and what she said was hers to use, that her judgment was not a deviation from the structure, but a part of it. She stacked a log and felt the weight of that distinction with the same physical completeness she felt the cold. 2 figures at the tree line. Edmund's height and coat on the left. A smaller figure walking independently on the right, boots dark to the knee with soaked snow hair, loose from whatever had held it, face red with cold. Ruth walked across the open field under the last pale light of the afternoon at a steady pace, not hurried, not distressed. The expression of someone returning from somewhere with information they had needed to go and find. Bram met them in the field. He looked at Ruth's boots. You hungry? Yes, Ruth said. Come on then. He walked her to the truck. Edmund followed, brushing snow from his sleeve. Gus ran out from the barn, barked once, and then wagged his tail and fell into step beside Ruth, as though escorting her. The last 20 meters were an obvious contribution to make. Nothing else happened. No assembly of the group to watch a lesson being administered. No raised voices. No formal processing of what had occurred. Ruth climbed into the truck and sat down and pulled her wet boots under the seat. Clara climbed in beside her. The truck drove south toward camp. After dinner, walking back to the barracks in the dark, Ruth said, thank you. For what? Clara said. For not telling them right away. Clara walked beside her in the cold. How did you know I did not? Because Edmund was not running when he came. A pause, breath visible in the air between them. In Germany, Ruth said, you would have told them in 10 minutes. We both know this, not because you are cruel, because that was what one did, what everyone did. Clara said nothing. Here you waited 3 hours, Ruth said. What changed? Clara thought about the answer for the rest of the walk. At the door of the barracks, she stopped. I did not want you punished, she said, and I trusted that you had reasons. Ruth looked at her. That is what changed, Clara said. She went inside. After lights out, Ruth spoke into the dark. There was nothing there. Clara waited. Trees, snow, cold. A frozen creek I almost did not see in time. The forest continued. The same trees, the same snow, the same silence. Nothing waiting on the other side of anything. A pause. It was not a fence. It was just the world being very large and entirely indifferent. And then you came back, Clara said. I thought about the kitchen, the stove, the weight of the coffee cup in both hands, specifically and not generally. I could smell the wood smoke. Ruth was quiet for a moment, and I understood something. What? That I came back because I wanted to, not because I could not leave, because I did not want to. Another pause. That is what the open boundary does. It does not hold you with wire. It makes you decide. Every single day, it makes you decide whether to stay or to go. And when you stay because you want to, that is something wire can never produce. The barracks was quiet. Clara. Yes. Why aren't they worried about us? The question had been waiting 6 weeks to be asked directly in the dark, where both of them could hear it without the deflection of daylight and activity. Clara looked at the ceiling. She had the 3 hypotheses. They were correct. They had always been correct. Desk in the reconstruction office, with the Montana County survey pinned to the wall above her, its creases soft from 8 months of being folded and unfolded in a barracks shelf. She took out paper and wrote back. We did not have a category for being trusted. That was the thing, not the coffee and not the food and not the absence of cruelty. Those we had explanations for. What we had no category for was being assumed trustworthy, being given the space to decide, and then living inside that space for 9 months. Every day that space asked us a question we did not know we were answering until we had already answered it. She sealed the letter and looked at the map on the wall. She knew where the camp was on that map, the specific unmarked point on the dirt road north of Milford. She knew the distance from that point to the tree line. She knew the distance from the tree line to the frozen creek. She knew the distance from the creek to nowhere in particular, which was where Ruth had walked to, and found that nowhere in particular was exactly what it was. She looked at the map for a while and then went back to drawing Munich. In the autumn of 1953, she took a train to Stuttgart. Ruth's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had been rebuilt in stages, the lower floors original, and the upper floors new, the difference legible in the brickwork. A city learning as all cities eventually learned to be continuous with itself again. They sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours and talked about work and weather and ordinary things and drank coffee and did not discuss the camp directly because they did not need to. It was present in the room the way shared experience is always present, not as a subject requiring discussion, but as the ground underneath the conversation. The thing that made these 2 particular women in this particular kitchen carry a weight that no outside observer could have fully accounted for. Before Clara left, she stood at the doorway with her coat on and her bag in her hand. Do you think we would have been different? Ruth said, if the camp had been what we expected. Clara thought about this honestly. If the camp had been what we expected, she said, we would have been right about everything. And being right about everything is a very small place to live. Ruth looked at her. The open boundary, Clara said. That is what made the difference, not the food or the treatment or any particular gesture. The open boundary. It forced us to choose every day whether what we believed was true or whether what we were seeing was true. You cannot do that from behind wire. Wire makes the choice for you and calls it safety. She went down the stairs and out into the Stuttgart afternoon. The street was ordinary and intact and full of people moving through their lives with the particular care of people who have learned not to take continuity for granted. She walked through them and thought about trust as architecture, not the kind that lives in words or in policy or in stated principle, but the kind that gets built into the physical structure of places, into wooden posts set in the ground without wire between them, into a question not asked, into a lighter held out and then put away, into a photograph placed on a desk between 2 people on opposite sides of a catastrophe, neither of them able to undo it, both of them choosing to remain in the room. A country confident enough in what it had made to leave the gate open and wait to see who came back. She boarded the train at Stuttgart and found her seat and looked out the window as the platform moved and fell behind. Germany went on in the autumn light outside the glass, still reckoning, still rebuilding, still in the long, slow process of deciding what it intended to become. Clara sat with her hands in her lap and the Montana maps folded in her bag and let it all pass. She had learned in a camp in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains that the most important measurements are not the ones that tell you where the fence is. They are the ones that tell you what has been built on the other side of it and whether it is worth the walk back. It was.